Hello everybody, I am George from Ireland. This video is going to be a review of the following book, The Enigma of Kidson, the portrait of a schoolmaster. So here you see Michael Kidson and one of his spaniels. I don't know which one this is. An unposed photo seems like to me, slightly out of focus, him looking quizzical there. He's just been surprised. That's towards the end of his time. So he was a beak at Eton. Beak is Eton slang for a teacher. Usually going to say teacher, bit old-fashioned. He used to say schoolmaster, but when I was there in the 90s, that was really no longer a thing that was said. But he was someone who liked to be a couple of generations older than himself. You can see in the dust jacket that Eton blue. I think Cambridge got it from Eton. Isn't that right? Eggshell blue is it called, and spaniels there. I'm not someone who appreciates the aesthetic very much, but even I have to acknowledge it's a beautifully bound book. So the book design is done well. So there he is in slightly younger days. This is a riveting read, and it provides a story that's interweaves his unique and imitable style with a bit about the schooling of some quite well-known public figures in the UK today. Kidson, as you discover if you dip into this delightful and perfectly constructed tome, was enigmatic because of his parentage, his parents splitting up, and I think actually divorcing in the 1930s when that was not the done thing. It was 1929 that was considered an absolute scandal, whether they were sinned against or sinning. Even if the parents lived apart, they shouldn't divorce because that was a long, expensive, and hideously embarrassing process. He had siblings he didn't know about till he was well into adulthood, so he had a deeply unhappy life. His mother abandoned him. His father couldn't cope. His grandparents sent him to a sort of a posh version of an orphanage. I think it was just actually called the Royal Orphanage in Wolverhampton, if I got that right, where Eric Idle of Monty Python was there, his contemporary, much younger, so they possibly didn't meet. Anyway, so there was this terrible coldness in his early life, which he never vouchsafed to anyone else, which speaks volumes about just how painful this was for him. And that may explicate his later difficulty in showing warmth towards others, not in the conventional way. He seemed to be almost cruel towards those whom he was fond of, perhaps because he couldn't bear to put himself in jeopardy. There's always a risk to forming an emotional bond. Remember Bill Clinton said about Princess Diana, grief is the price we pay for love. If you love someone, well, that's very gratifying. But if that person dies, or if that person betrays you or something, then the agony is just unbearable. So he engaged in persiflage, more robust than was the norm even for that era. He was an anachronism even at the time that he was at Eton. So it's by one of his former pupils, Jamie Blackett, who was there, I think in the 70s, I got that right. So this is partly a memoir by him, and he stitched it together masterfully. He has many quotations from all sorts of people, Kidson's colleagues, as well as many other boys who are taught by the redoubtable Michael Kidson. So this is truly a labour of love. So Blackett is the narrator, and as I say, he has to introduce excerpts from various pupils. He must have solicited them sending in their remembrances of him. So these gobbets managed to still have some sort of narrative flow. You think that the risk you'd run would be a certain lack of coherence, but no. Now, it doesn't begin in 1929 when he takes his first squalling breath. No, it begins sort of part way through, and then we get this brusque pen portrait of Kidson. So it takes us through the pinnacle of his career, and then it goes back to his childhood, which was the right approach, as Blackett himself explained. Biographies that are strictly chronological are sometimes tedious, and we get mired in the minutiae of the playpen, and we don't want that. We want to get down to the real meat and potatoes of what was he like, this incredibly acerbic character. Anyway, so there are many cameos in here, included by Cameron. but he's not performing a part. He is recalling his time when he's in Mr. Faulkner's house at Eton, David Cameron, and how he was up to Michael Kidson, and that was Etonian slang for being taught by. Who are you up to, as in who's teaching you whatever subject it is. So it was nauseating to read the former Prime Minister's effusive praise for Kidson, because under the policies promulgated by the Cabinet administration, the Kidsons of this day, well, they just don't exist. They're an extinct species. Kidson's behaviour would be utterly impossible these days, just inconceivable, people would be barred from working with minors for life for a fraction of what Kidson got up to. And I think some of what Kidson got up to, and I'm quite broad-minded on these things, was a bit shocking even for that epoch. I know someone who taught at Oundle School who was barred for doing a very small amount of what Kidson did, as in certainly controversial jokes he used to crack. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, that cult conservative, he is quoted in there extensively. The contributions from some of Kidson's colleagues, Sir Eric Anderson of Happy and Glorious Memory, died just in April this year. He was headmaster in Kidson's time. Notably, Eton's the only school in the world to spell headmaster, not as a compound word, but the headmaster is commonly known as the head man to the boys. There's quotations there from Sir Andrew Gailey, who was Prince William's housemaster and Prince Harry's housemaster, because the Beaks, the teachers, they provided with accommodation, and he lived in a colony, as in a group of them together, and there was a live-in cook. So they lived in some style, so sort of like Victorian gentlemen, and that's going to this very day. Plus, they live in the Thames Valley. Until recent times, accommodation there wasn't pricey, but these days it's just exorbitantly expensive. And even with Eton's liberal remuneration, someone on a teacher's salary, even well above average teacher salary, would find it eye-watering to afford commodious accommodation in that part of the United Kingdom. James Cook is quoted there as well, JNBC, not Captain Cook, but James Norris Beaumont Cook, who was a housemaster in my time, taught chemistry, and latterly he was vice provost, I think. A lovely, amiable chap, Carthusian, don't hold that against him, who was there for absolutely donkey's years. James Cook was a confirmed bachelor, so we thought. And then, the year before he retired, he stunned the world by getting married. There was a new dame came in, a lady of about his own vintage, and I don't know if she had previously married, but they fell in love and they got married. You wouldn't think it. There he was at age about 59. So, don't give up hope. Love can come later in life. So Kidson, he was there from 1965 to 94, appointed by Anthony Shenwick Trench. Shenwick Trench would maybe deserve a video on his own. I remember when Eton Renewed was published in 94, we found out loads about him. I interviewed Tim Card, then Vice Provost of Eton. Shenwick Trench, a controversial character, when he'd done things like changing the admission systems, no longer making it a virtually guaranteed thing for sons of old boys to get in. But the controversial thing about Shenwick Trench was, well, his dipsomania, but also his flagellomania. And he was headmaster of Fettes, Blair's headmaster. The plaque to him in the chapel at Fettes has been taken down, not to Blair, sorry, to Shenwick Trench, because there are allegations of child abuse, not just caning, which was completely legal at the time, possibly sexual abuse. Well, that's the allegations. Whether true or not, I don't know. But anyway, so a bit about more about Kidson. So he did his national service. All youths were required to do 2 years in the armed forces in those days, unless they're becoming a doctor or mentally, physically disabled kind of thing. So he was in the Royal Artillery. He was a ranker, and it might have rankled that he didn't get promoted to be an officer, and he kept that quiet. It was something to live down, because his colleagues will have mostly done national service and invariably been officers, and it might have been considered profoundly shameful that he was amongst the other ranks. Remember, there was crashing snobbery there in my day. There is even now, but maybe it's more strictly financial than social. I think being nouveau riche is no longer such a criticism. I wasn't nouveau riche because I wasn't the riche part, just the nouveau. Anyway, so and then he left that. He went to Cambridge and a forgettable college, such that I've actually forgotten which one, and he got a 2-2 in history. So this would not be regarded as an illustrious academic record, because as the book notes, the other Beaks, they'd been to one of the grander colleges, Oxford or Cambridge, and those invariably Oxbridge when he came up in the 60s. And usually a first, occasionally a 2-1. And if you had something like a 2-2, and 2-2s were awarded more generally, those maybe. Have we grade inflation? Possibly, or it's more competitive these days. Those is any class a degree, third class degree, even from a bad university. Yeah, you were in a tiny minority. You were guaranteed a good job. So maybe he didn't really pull the finger out. But if you had a 2-2 or a third or something as a teacher at Eton, you needed to have something else to compensate it for that, like being an outstanding sportsman or a chorister or gifted in some other way. What else are you bringing to the party? So then he joined Shell Oil. His period as an oil man in the Netherlands didn't suit him. He taught at Papplewick, a prep school just across the road from Ascot Racecourse, still going. And after a few happy enough years there, he got a job at Eton. These days, moving from a prep school to a secondary school is almost unheard of. So that they thought because he taught prep school boys, he might be able at teaching those who are less academically gifted at Eton. You'd think he might have been daunted by Eton's awe-striking reputation, given his relatively lowly background. He had a slender claim to be a scholar or a sportsman, as I pointed out. I'm not saying it was dim. Okay, a 2-2 from Cambridge, that's still fantastic. But bear in mind who he was up against, who his colleagues were. There's a school obviously hoary with age, and he hadn't been to Eton, one of the top public schools. So a lot of the teachers had been to ordinary public schools. A few had been to state schools. But remember, you were going to get, if you were not thought to be posh enough, a lot of the boys were going to look down their aquiline noses at you. Anyway, so he never gains promotion in Eton. He did seek to take over a house, but that didn't happen for him because he was considered a bit too old. He got his job at Eton at the age of 36, if I got that right. But he has attained pedagogical apotheosis in this noble tome, and that's surely a far higher accolade than taking over a house, which I think is a thankless task and a bloody nightmare, because you're going to have one rat in your house ruining your life. I should know. I was one of them. That the odds are, come on, out of 50, and if it's not them, it's going to be the parents. As one housemaster said, I know, the fathers don't worry so much about, is the mothers will be hellish. Anyway, so the fact that this book was penned by one of his pupils shows that he inspired deathless devotion in people. He was by turns irascible, recalcitrant, just impossible to deal with, superlatively rude. He was the master of the epigrammatic put down, and it's got so many quotations. It's just replete with these hilarious one-liners. So it really repays the effort to read it. I've just read it now in 2 days, almost unput-downable. I had to do a bit of work, but I'm going to read it all the way through right again now. So under his carapace, he was as tender as can be, this hard exterior sort of thing, but really soft-hearted. And it showed sometime, like he wept copiously over the death of Sir Robert Peel when he was reading aloud to his boys, and that might have really discombobulated them, because he seemed to be harsh, scathing, vicious at times. But it's almost as though he wore a mask, as I say, trying to emotionally distance himself from people. He may have seemed impenetrable. Was that an act? Was much of his persona performative? Probably. And what was the true personality beneath that? Perhaps he feared the vulnerability that would result from opening up to people. There was this aura of condescension about him, but he was also disconsolate over the death of his hounds, because they were his surrogate family. And again, well, a bit like the Catholic sacerdotal tradition of celibacy, the fact that he had no spouse, no offspring, meant he could be utterly dedicated to the welfare of his boys and to some extent his colleagues. And he was a very collegial sort, loved socializing with them, so had a very forward personality and never seemed to suffer a moment's self-doubt, was willing to stand up to authority. He ran great risks for his pupils. So this is also really a memoir of a bygone era. It's as irrecoverable of Lyonesse, in many ways a much happier, better era, and education has suffered immeasurably since that. What a declension the United Kingdom has gone through, not just Eton in those terms. I know a few things are better. All right, I'm not talking about technology. Technology has improved, but the dumbing down and so on, but the loss of the unique contribution people like him could bring. So Kidson had his commonplace book where he got all these sparkling quotations from various novels or various statesmen, and he used them. He taught history, just in case I forgot to point that out. It's got lots of extracts of this book from his correspondence, his missives to housemasters. He crossed swords with a redoubtable RPC foreman, Roderick Foreman. He was a King's Scholar at Eton, captain of school, no doubt, in the 1950s. There's a photo of him meeting Haile Selassie, as in the last emperor of Ethiopia, and he was about elbow high, Roddy Foreman. Mr. Foreman, he taught maths, a lovely chap, had the sort of BBC accent circa 1939, very genuine. I was very fond of him, and coached people in the wall game and so on, coached South American League or Patagonian League, whatever it was called, which is sort of football for like people who've got two left feet, such as yours truly. And I was very sorrowful to read about Mr. Foreman dying a couple of years ago. Lovely chap. I would love to have seen him again. I know he wasn't everyone's cup of tea, a housemaster for quite some time, an absolute alpha mind. And after university, might surprise some people, he chose to be a beak. That was the life that satisfied him. Say, yes, but you're a maths whiz, you could go into the city, make a fortune. Didn't appeal to him. He was happy doing something else, and he was good at it. Anyway, so Foreman argued with Kidson about the field game final. The field game is this unique sport at Eton. I shan't bother trying to explain its arcane rules. And there was a rackets match on. Rackets is a little bit like squash. I don't think it's quite unique to Eton. I've only tried to play it once, and having no hand-eye coordination, I couldn't play it at all. But anyway, he was master in charge of rackets, despite I think never having played rackets till he'd been to Eton. So he was willing to squabble with people. The headmaster had to ask him about various things when he was rather too indulgent of his pupils. There's a thing called tutorials at Eton. So you do your ordinary lessons, 20 boys in the class or whatever, and you have your housemaster. You also have your tutor. You go to see him once a week. You call this a tutorial private business. It's not really academic. It's a little bit like PSHE. It's often discussing their general academic progress or broadening their education, doing things that are outside the syllabus. You might ask them to read and write. You might be, PSHE exercise why smoking is so bad or something, or getting them to think about UCAS and careers. I'm not sure what else you would discuss. Politics slightly. And so one is chosen for you for the first 3 years. It used to be called your classical tutor. That's long before my time. I think it usually was a classic speak. But they also set you exercise in English, because well into the 20th century, English was hardly a subject. You expected to know English anyway. But your classical tutor might just check on your written English and grammar and so on, because much of your schooling was about Latin, ancient Greek, French, German, a few other things like, say, history and the sciences. And then a modern tutor whom you chose for your last 2 years. Specialisation, as in A-levels, because you specialise in 3 or 4 subjects. So where he really came into his own, it was as a specialist tutor. So tutoring boys in their last 2 years at Eton, C block and B block, and most schools would be year 12, year 13. There used to be an A block well into the 90s. You had to stay, into the 80s. Had to stay on an extra term to apply for Oxford or Cambridge. Long time ago, you had to stay on an extra year at school, and you weren't guaranteed to get in, because that's how much of a difference it made, and that's how hard it was to get in. So there'd be like roughly 5 boys in a tutorial, and coming to his flat, and he would chat to them and oversee their general intellectual development, and say, you want permission to be in a play, you need his signature, because he might say, no, you're snowed under with work, you're behind, I refuse permission to do this and that, so he knows what's going on in your life. If you're commended for good effort in a subject, your tutor would know about that. It had to be signed by you. If you were also got a rip, as in you were in trouble because you'd failed a test or something, he would know. And he's a sort of another point of contact for your parents, or if you had some beef with your housemaster, you had your tutor to go to, and vice versa. Anyway, so he allowed boys to drink and smoke in tutorials, but I think we were served sherry in tutorials, even when some boys were 16. That was okay, but smoking cigarettes, even in the 60s, I think, was not allowed at Eton, except in the pop room. The Eton Society is officially called. These guys are like pop and jays with their bright waistcoats. That's not what they're called, pop. I won't go into that. The police are allowed to break the rules. They were allowed to drink and smoke in the pop room. But that was gone by the 90s, even though they did drink and smoke. At loads of porn videos there in the 90s. But he was allowing them to drink a bit too much, and the smoking cigarettes was not on when he was doing it well up until 94. But anyway, he somehow got away with that. You wouldn't get away with that now. So he once conducted a tutorial from the bath. as it reveals. Now, the door was only slightly ajar so they could hear him. That would be a real no-no now. There was never any whisper that he overstepped the bounds of propriety towards his pupils, much less illegality. But these days, there's a presumption of guilt. And, children are brought up to believe that most men are pedos, so he would have been out of there pretty quick. Now, there was nothing immoral about Kidson, but it was still sailing close to the wind, even in the old days, because this is only a quarter of a century ago, but it seems like much longer ago because so much has changed and it's so hyper-regulated. There's all this micromanagement from the government, and Cameron is partly responsible for that. Remember the Teachers' Code of Conduct came in under Michael Gove, Education Secretary? Yeah, under Cameron. Gove was serving under Cameron. So Cameron ought to meditate and pause. What did you do? He's the reason why that someone like Kidson just couldn't exist anymore. He's a fossil. So he was erudite. He was an exacting taskmaster, and he had this sort of toe up the hole philosophy when it came to getting the best out of pupils. Is praised very sparingly indeed, and often castigate people's work, and that will force them to improve. So there's plenty of reproof from him. He seemed to declare psychological warfare on people, beaks as well as boys, deliberately calling them by the wrong name. Boys only addressed by surnames in those days, never by Christian names. Anyway, so the boys welcomed his admonition, and I suppose they sensed that he was well-meaning. So he sallied forth far beyond the syllabus. He gave them the privilege of a magnificent education, and they were very much ingratiated because of that. So he added to their cultural enrichment. He insisted on clarity and accuracy, as the book details. He was very firm and demanding, constantly raising the bar in terms of the quality of their written work and oral arguments. So it's a bit like a personal trainer at the gym, pushing you harder than you would push yourself, and that's you get better results. People are inclined to be a little bit torpid and just give up when they're feeling the strain. No, we make you go much further and get far more out of you. But he was sometimes hyper-correct and supercilious, so you can imagine he wasn't everybody's cup of char. Drive some people up the wall, his pedantry, and then his really ridiculously old-fashioned pronunciations. I don't know if this wasn't even BBC English. What was it? Was he just trying a bit too hard to speak like Queen Victoria or something? But he had a pachydermous memory for his pupils when he bumped into them on the street decades later. So yeah, that was private business I talked about when he's seeing the boys in small groups, and the people who are in his private business, he'd see them, half a century after he first met them, and still remember everything about them. So it shows how much they meant to him, and he meant a great deal to his erstwhile pupils. So he often intervened to mitigate the harshness of the disciplinary system, pleading for boys not to be sacked from the school if they were, letting at least one Nat Rothschild live in his flat so he could take his A-levels, things like that. He was very often cavalier, had a two-fingers-up attitude to the rules a lot of the time. Yet he was fastidious about other things, sartorially speaking. He was punctilious. He went in for a great deal of badinage with his pupils as well as his colleagues and housemates. He subscribed to this great man theory of history. Some people thought he was a misogynist, but that was proved wrong a few times in the book. He didn't study women a great deal in history just because they wielded very little power. And it's very much history from above which enthralled him. High politics, that was really his shtick in history. So there was so much eccentricity about him. Was it studied? I suspect to some extent it was. Yes, I know he went to an independent school, but in the West Midlands, would he really have spoken with that stratospherically posh accent? I suspect not. Anyway, he was always using you words and didn't like people trying to use euphemism. He wouldn't say passed away, he'd say died. He was candid about things. So his antique pronunciation seemed rather Pecksniffian to some. Anyway, but he did his boys the favour of demanding they do better. He did not tell them that mediocrity was excellence, right? That would be as ludicrous as doing the opposite. And so he insisted that they improve. And they're grateful to him in the long run, like David Cameron memorably wrote in there that he was made to write out 100 times that he would put a comma after the adverbial however. There's a sort of lesson that will be seared into your memory. You shan't forget something like that. So he inspired undying loyalty, and the book stands as testament to that. But this book is an elegy, and it's also elegiac for a vanished world of schoolmasters and not teachers, schoolmasters. And someone like Kidson no doubt would have believed that a schoolmaster was born and not made. These things couldn't be taught, it couldn't be trained into you. Anyway, so he was a natural. He had this flair for vivifying history, really just with the power of his verbal description, using evocative language, and that really brought these scenes to life. And we would also focus on the seamier side of life, I should say. He's quite often prurient in what he said, and you wouldn't get away with any of that these days. So he was a colourful character himself, and he focused on people like that, larger than life historical figures, and telling us things you wouldn't need to know for the exam, but they certainly held the boy's interest. So he used sesquipedalian lexis, and that appears to have left a mark on the Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg, for one, who's probably notable for being the first person in history to use the word flocky knocky nihilpilification in the House of Commons. So Kidson, he stretched his pupils. He expected them to do more. Then they proved themselves capable of more than they had thought possible. So they surprised themselves, and therein lay his genius. And he would not last kissing time in this era of lesson plans, observations, inspections, assessment objectives, coursework, target grades, grade inflation. He never did any teacher training at all, not a day in his life. And now we have blizzards of regulations and these reams of these directives and tick box tyranny, and that would have driven out of teaching, and that was coming in towards the time. Remember, until about 1988, there was no national curriculum in the United Kingdom. In 1979, James Callaghan, the Prime Minister, lamented he had not the least influence of what was taught in UK schools. Long may it so remain. I know there were some downsides to the old system, but if the choice were binary between what we've got today and how it was back in the 70s, I would go for that in a second, without a moment's hesitation. So